The Insight. The Insitome.
Podcast.
Genetics.
Human.
Archaeology.
Denisovans.
Neanderthals.
Metabolism.
Ancestry.
Where in the world did we come from?
I am.
Unique DNA.
Genome. From Austin,
Texas.
This week, the Neolithic Revolution.
Today we are going to be talking about the Neolithic.
The Neolithic.
Yes.
One of my favorite topics.
Yep, you know a lot about this, Spencer, so I'm going to let you start off. Like, what's special about the Neolithic? What does it mean?
Lithos in Greek means stone. And so people have arbitrarily divided human prehistory into what we call Paleolithic and Neolithic. Paleolithic is the Old Stone Age. Neo, which means new, is the New Stone Age. The Lower Paleolithic starts 2.5 million years ago-ish, so basically around the time what we consider to be our genus, the genus Homo, appears in the fossil record and the first evidence of stone tools. So Old Stone Age. And that extends all the way up until very recently, till around 10,000 years ago-ish, when we enter the Neolithic. So most of human history was spent in the Paleolithic. Then we entered the New Stone Age around 10,000 years ago. So that's a description of the terminology. But what does it mean? What happened around 10,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, this is really the dividing line, one of the major dividing lines in the history of our species. This is when we settled down and stopped being nomadic or semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers and became farmers in a few locations around the world. And this was a huge shift for our species. It led from a few million people, we estimate, living as hunter-gatherers scattered around the world at that time, so again, 10,000 years ago, to 7.5 billion of us today.
Yeah.
And increasing to 9.5, 10 billion maybe by the middle of this century.
Yeah.
So it had a huge effect on the population, and it also gave us everything we think of when we think of civilization.
Yeah.
So it gave us government, and it gave us cities, and it gave us writing, and it gave us all these things that came down to us.
Well, you know, one way I like to think about it in terms of farming is the number of calories you can get per acre, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, when you increase the number of calories you can get per acre by, say, a tenfold, you know, you're going to get 10 times more people living up to the Malthusian limit. So it's really just like basic energetics on a level of in terms of the transition from the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. A quick side question. I've always wondered, like, what's up with the Mesolithic?
The Mesolithic to me is kind of a misnomer.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it's basically that part of the Upper Paleolithic. And the Upper Paleolithic started, depends on exactly where you're talking about and who's doing the talking, but somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago. And it extended up until the dawn of the Neolithic. And in some places, in Europe in particular, that part of the Upper Paleolithic that is just before the transition of the Neolithic is called the Mesolithic.
Yeah. Yeah. So, when I've read papers about Mesolithic hunter-gatherers living nearby Neolithic farmers, obviously that's a little strange because they're, temporally like in the same, position, but they're defined differently, right?
Yeah.
Based on their lifestyle. So, I mean, I think that's a little confusing in terms of the granularity when you get close in time because...
Well, it is. And, listen, we talk about this as though it was a pretty simple process. It's like, who wants to live as a hunter-gatherer? That's really rough and tumble, and I can't imagine people choosing to do that. And it was called the Neolithic Revolution by Gordon Childe, who was a British archaeologist who wrote about this in the early 20th century. It was called a revolution for a reason. I mean, this was a massive shift in lifestyle, and we can see evidence for that in the skeletal record. So if you look at the skeletons of hunter-gatherers living in, say, the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is a study, very famous one, published in the 1980s by a guy named Lawrence Angel, an anthropologist. And he looked at all sorts of morphometric characteristics of skeletons across this transition. So from Upper Paleolithic into the Neolithic time zone and even beyond. And what he sees is that people became less healthy and they died younger after the development of farming.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's always been the big mystery. And that's the reason, I ended up writing a book about this.
Yeah.
is
Pandora's seed.
I came across, that chart, that table when I was doing research for Journey of Man many years ago. And I wondered, well, okay, so if they're dying younger and they're unhealthier and they're on average, 6 inches shorter for guys than, the upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, why did people ever become farmers in the first place?
Yeah. And so, I mean, why don't we talk about the younger dryads a little? Because I know that's mentioned in Pandora's Seed, and that looms large in a lot of theories.
It does. So, the big mystery is not only why did people make that transition if they were unhealthier and, they didn't seem to be as robust and so on. Not only why did they decide to do that, but why did it happen independently at several locations around the world at the same time? So, obviously the best study perhaps is in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, but we see around the same time a transition to rice agriculture in the foothills of the Himalayas, so over in East Asia. We see a transition in the highlands of New Guinea, roughly around that time. We see a transition to maize or corn agriculture in southern Mexico, and then a transition to potato-dominated agriculture in the highlands of the Andes. Yeah. There was no social media in those days. It wasn't like people were tweeting out, hey, farming, really awesome. You guys should try this out. So there must have been something going on globally around that time. And, you can speculate that maybe this was part of a trajectory that human evolution was bound to move into. As you get to carrying capacity, you kind of saturate the land in terms of what you were talking about, the number of calories you can produce. As hunter-gatherers, we're expanding all over the place. We make it to the ends of the earth, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego in South America. Like, at some point, you're going to reach carrying capacity, and to move beyond that, you've got to innovate in some way. And so there could just be this process that's been happening. But
why did it happen at the same time?
Why did it happen at the same time? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain.
Time,
So the thinking is there must have been some global climate event that happened around that time. And so let's put it in context. When we talk about people expanding around the world, starting 60,000 years ago-ish, coming out of Africa and the Middle East, and moving out into Asia, down to Southeast Asia, Siberia, Europe, and ultimately into the Americas, this is all taking place during the last ice age. And that ice age reaches its peak, the last glacial maximum, between roughly 20,000 and 16,000 years ago, depending on where you were. But in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly, around 18,000 years ago. And after 16,000 years ago, we started coming out of that. And the conditions became much more livable for ancient humans, for hunter-gatherers. And in a few places around the world, they started to specialize on gathering the grains that were growing wild in that area. And so it was wheat and barley in the Middle East, and it was rice in East Asia, and teosinte, which is the ancestor of corn in southern Mexico. And the stands of these wild, naturally occurring grains became dense enough that people could actually start to settle down. And so you actually have a hunter-gatherer culture that develops in the Middle East, and this is where we have the best data, called the Natufian. Around this time, so this is during the beginnings of what we call the Holocene, so the nice part of human history post-Ice Age. So this is 14, 13, 12,000 years ago. And these people actually built permanent settlements, but they were still living as hunter-gatherers. And the reason they could do that is because the food supplies were so stable. Now, the problem is, starting around 11,000 years ago, we were forced back into Ice Age-like conditions for a period of a little over 1,000 years. And this is a period known as the Younger Dryas to people who study archaeology and paleoanthropology. It takes its name from a small plant that's found in the tundra in Scandinavia, in particular, a plant called Dryas octopetala. It kind of fades away when the conditions are good, and it comes back when tundra comes in and kind of replaces what was there when conditions were nicer. And so we see it going away and then coming back during this 1,000-year phase, and that's a sign that the climate is shifting. It's becoming more like the Ice Age. So the theory that has been proposed, including by myself, is that all these people who had decided to start specialize in particular types of grains in different parts of the world when they were living as hunter-gatherers during this nice phase of the early Holocene were forced into food shortages during the Younger Dryas. And they had to innovate in order to survive.
That's what you do.
And the innovation was, well, let's not rely on gathering all this food. Let's start to grow it.
Yeah, become more intensive in your lifestyle.
Yeah. And then, they came out of that younger Dryas period, and, the conditions were really good, and they started to select for certain characteristics in those grains. And there are genetic aspects to all of these grains. They have polyploid genomes, and so there are multiple copies of genes that you can start to select for, and it gets a little complicated. But basically, these were kind of the plants that you would have chosen if you're going to create a domesticated version of this wild species. And so we selected for all this stuff, and lo and behold, within a couple of thousand years, we are fully within the Neolithic with pretty much modern-day types of grains.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was an abrupt, radical shift. Okay,
and so, it was a radical shift. So we go from, having a variety of foods in our diet to shifting towards, we talk about the staff of life.
Yeah. Probably the best studied site is Abu Huraira, which is a site from northern Syria along the Euphrates River. And it's kind of an interesting story in archaeology because the Syrian government announced back in the early 70s that they were going to be creating a dam on the Euphrates to stabilize the water supply, and that this whole site was going to be flooded. And that the archaeologists had, I think it was a couple of years, in order to do the dig. And, that's unusual in archaeology. Things typically take a much longer period of time. But they basically went in, and this was like, emergency archaeology. Yeah. And they uncovered, the transition very, clearly in this archaeological site. The transition from this Natufian period, the hunter-gatherers, all the way down into, middle and later Neolithic. Yeah. And they found things like, well, the hunter-gatherers that were living there prior to the Neolithic transition were utilizing about 150 different species of plants from the environment. So really diverse diet. Yeah. After the Neolithic transition, they're only utilizing about 8, and they're getting the majority of their calories from, wheat and barley. Yeah. And so, that's the most radical shift that we see in the Neolithic is this shift from a very broad, diverse hunter-gatherer diet to a very depauperate diet in a way. You're basically
monoculture.
It's a monoculture, and you're basically living off of carbs.
Yeah, which is very different. Depending on there's a lot of arguments about what's our Paleolithic diet. The one thing that I would suggest is, Paleolithic people, hunter-gatherers, are very diverse. In terms of sedentary hunter-gatherers, we actually, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and we have an example of sedentary hunter-gatherers there. They're the salmon fishermen. So obviously these salmon runs, they're there every year, extremely calorically rich. So, they didn't move around that much. In the recent past, mostly hunter-gatherers have been pushed to marginal areas. Right? I believe that there's been a really strong selection for hunter-gatherers that live in, difficult terrain, places that are not farmable. But in the past, they lived in the bottomlands. They lived in very rich territories. So I think, we have to be careful about generalization. But I think the primary issue, which you have fixed upon, is going from diversity to lack of diversity.
Yeah, and this is where we get into the genetics. And, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. But this whole idea that the hunter-gatherers we think of today represent the status of hunter-gatherers 15, 20, 30,000 years ago, I think is really incorrect, and I think you really hit it on the head. The hunter-gatherers today are living in places where the farmers can't live, basically. Yeah. We see this in Africa with the Bantu expansion. Again, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but, the expansion of this farming culture out of West Africa, and it takes over most of the continent, most of Sub-Saharan Africa. And the hunter-gatherers that were living all over the place, certainly in Eastern Africa, were kind of shunted down into the Kalahari Desert. And so you go there today.
Or in the rainforest.
Or in the rainforest. Yeah. And you go to the Kalahari today, and you see the Bushmen that are out there speaking their click languages. And you're like, why are they choosing to live in a desert? And it's because they didn't actually choose that. The Bantus forced them into it.
The deserts chose them.
So the desert is where the Bantu couldn't grow their crops. Yeah. And so the hunter-gatherers got what was left.
Yeah, yeah. And so, we have these selection biases in terms of our ethnography or anthropology, and we have to be careful about them because, the past was very different in some ways. Now, in terms of the genetics, which is what we're interested in, Some of these changes happen very fast. Like 1,000-year timescales are evolutionarily very fast. But, changes did occur. And we see them in our genome now. In the 2000s, there began to be genomic methods which would look through the genome. So, there's a paper out of Jonathan Pritchard's lab.
Jonathan Pritchard's
2006.
very, influential, famous paper published in 2006.
Yeah, and so this is different than the older style of genetics where you would look at a gene and then try to explain how the variation of that gene explained variation of the population and its evolutionary history. This method basically just took the whole genome, scanned it, and then saw what the hits were in terms of whatever statistical test you want to run. So in this case, it's the integrated haplotype score, the IHS. They looked for haplotype sweeps through the genome. To make a long story short, basically, they're looking for positive selection. And they found it in particular classes of genes. And one of those was diet.
Absolutely. Yeah, which is what we would have predicted. Now, just to explain a little bit about what they're looking for, if we think about the level of linkage between variable sites in the human genome, there's this kind of background level of haplotype structure. So this is how the variants are attached to each other in the same strand of DNA.
Sequence.
And anything that is going to be selected for pretty much arises once. It's a unique event, so it's on a single DNA strand.
Yeah.
And as it's driven to higher frequency by selection, recombination will chop that down into shorter and shorter pieces. And the longer selection takes, the shorter that segment is.
Yep.
And what Pritchard was able to calculate is basically that, there were segments all over the genome that seem to have been driven to higher frequency by selection within the last 10,000 years.
Basically homogenized blocks.
Yeah.
So the Pritchard method, the integrated haplotype, the IHS method is actually what it's doing is detecting sweeps, selection events that have not totally completed, and they're usually relatively recent, and we're talking an evolutionary scale, so on the order of 10,000 years or less, which is actually within the window that we are talking about right now in terms of the archaeology and anthropology, because agriculture started about 10,000 years ago. Now, the key issue here, though, is it started 10,000 years ago, but that doesn't mean that everyone is descended from people that were farmers 10,000 years ago.
What do you mean by that?
Well, let's look at Europe. Agriculture started with the Natufians in the Eastern Mediterranean and eventually spread to Europe. And
this is one of the big debates in archaeological history.
It was a big debate.
Yeah. Did farming spread with the spread of people coming out of the Fertile Crescent? We see archaeological evidence for the spread of farming into Europe over several thousand years. Is that the spread of people moving with the farming, or is it simply the diffusion of a concept?
Yeah.
And so the example I like to give is you can go to a village in remote parts of, Indonesia and see people wearing, P. Diddy or Britney Spears t-shirts. That is not because, the followers of those musicians went over and colonized the place. It's because the culture is diffused. Yeah. So, cultures can move without the spread of people, memes. And so the big debate has been, over the last century and a half, was it the spread of people or was it the spread of the idea of farming?
Yeah.
And it turns out
it's mostly actually the spread of people.
Which is cool.
Yeah. In the late 90s, Spencer was, working with Cavalli Forza at Stanford, and he was interested in this question, and there was a debate between him, other geneticists, archaeologists, using modern distributions of genes. So the thing that has revolutionized our understanding really is the ancient DNA, and to make a long story short, what the ancient DNA has shown in Europe is massive discontinuity. So if you do a transect in time and you're sampling the genes, there's a huge shift when it comes from going from hunter-gatherer to farmer.
So you say transect in time. This is literally like an archaeological dig where you've got older layers below the newer layers.
Yeah.
And you can use carbon dating and look at the tools that they have and the pottery and stuff and assign them to cultures. And literally, if you're lucky, you can also sample DNA from those layers and sequence the genomes.
Yeah, we have hundreds, like 500, I think, ancient. Not all of them are hunter-gatherers. So one of the facts that really shocked people when they saw it and I think, Spencer, maybe you were on one of these papers of ancient DNA in Europe, is the genetic difference between the hunter-gatherers and the farmers when they initially met was incredibly large, as large as the difference between someone who's Northern European and Chinese. And this difference persisted for as long as 1 to 2,000 years in certain areas. And that indicates a lot of cultural segregation and really, really specific adaptation to whatever lifestyle that they were focusing on, because probably not that much interaction.
So when you talk about discontinuity,
Yeah.
that's a very nice way of saying, that something probably not very nice went on.
Yeah, I mean, most of the listeners probably know something about American history.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good analogy. If anyone is actually really curious about this, I would recommend the book War Before Civilization by Lawrence Keeley.
Yeah, great book.
There's really some detail. This is before the ancient DNA came out, but it really prefigures many of the results. It looks like the area that the hunter-gatherers resisted the most were the marine foragers, the hunter-gatherers, where their population density was probably higher. So this was probably just a matter of numbers. If you're outnumbered by a factor of, say, 10 to 100, with primitive agriculture, probably closer to 10. But in any case, you are going to cede ground. You will retreat just like the Kalahari Bushmen did, or the Pygmies do in Africa.
That makes sense.
And so you either, get killed, or you retreat, or your daughters or your wives are taken. We do see some gene flow in certain mtDNA haplogroups that span hunter-gatherers and farmers, right?
And is it on the female side biased?
Yeah,
in the way
it's
we
female.
predict?
Yeah, it tends to be female biased. Obviously at some point, hunter-gatherers did transition to farming in some locales. And so when we see, quote, hunter-gatherer ancestry, it's a little confusing because we were all hunter-gatherers at some point. It's just a finite number of populations shifted to farming. And the shift to farming is not... It's not like the transmission of a Mickey Mouse meme. Farming is a difficult lifestyle. If you just think about it intuitively, if a typical American was told, okay, now you need to farm because the supply chain is gone and, you can't go to the supermarket, you just wouldn't have the skills, And so this is something that's going to take a lot of generations, and a lot of these populations didn't have many generations because more numerous people were coming. They were on the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about it. We talk about these things in terms of historical transitions. We read about it in textbooks. It's fairly, sterilized.
Yeah.
So we talk about discontinuities, for instance.
Yeah.
But, if you put yourself back in those times, as you say, farming was tough. It took a lot of labor. And that's part of the reason why these people weren't as healthy is, they were performing this kind of back-breaking work literally day in, day out. And being a hunter-gatherer, you had a pretty good lifestyle. So there was a famous gathering in the 1960s, I believe it was, the Man the Hunter Symposium. And they looked at hunter-gatherers around the world and made estimates based on, studies of ancient remains. And what they calculated was that the average hunter-gatherer was spending a tiny minority of their waking hours finding food.
Yeah.
And in fact, farmers had to spend a lot more time than hunter-gatherers producing food. And therefore, the hunter-gatherers, had the luxury of lots of time to sit around telling stories and making stone tools and all the stuff that
just
hunter-gatherers do. Just chilling.
Yeah.
So you really gave up something
Yeah.
when you became a farmer. In addition, because of this focus on particular crops and the fact that you were creating monocultures, if there was a drought one year, you might not have any food the following year.
Yeah.
And so there was probably a lot of fluctuation in population from one year to the next.
Yep.
And it was a very tenuous existence. It's something we don't think about today because we've got this global food chain. But if you've literally got to grow what your family's going to eat for the next year, and you have one growing season, as you do in Europe, if things go bad, if it rains too much or it doesn't rain enough, you're SOL.
Yeah. And so, I mean, die-offs, they are what we would call hard selection. So you have fertility differences that are correlated with traits. So on the margin, in these marginal times, people that will be able to metabolize just a little bit better, get more nutrients just a little bit better, they will have higher fitness. And so this is how evolution is happening. Some of the evolution will happen just through increased fertility because there's a land surplus. But the reality is farmers fill up the land very quickly. Like anyone who's, looked at growth equations and populations know that population growth can be rapid. And so they fill up the land. At that point, they're at carrying capacity. And when there's a drought, obviously you're going to have differential fitness based on either biological characteristics or someone who's just wealthier, they're in a better position. These sorts of issues are affecting the allele frequencies, these genetic changes over time. And as I've mentioned earlier, hunter-gatherers and farmers actually didn't seem to have intermarried that much. And you can kind of see this when you look at our modern ethnographic cases among the Pygmies and the Khoisan. There is some gene flow, but it's probably not nearly as much as you would think, especially considering the numbers of Pygmies and Khoisan. They're not that many. If it was just like a small fraction every year, pretty soon there'd be no genetic differences. The fact that there are still huge genetic differences indicates that the barrier is very high. So if you use this analogy for Europe, or anywhere else, actually, and I do think it's generalizable, you do have these two populations who aren't engaging in gene flow, and they're being subject to different selective pressures, right? And so one of them is dietary, but as Spencer earlier alluded, farming had a lot of knock-on consequences. So you have this fluctuation now. You have droughts. Well, maybe you should store for next year. Well, store it in a centralized place, maybe. Okay, to store it in a centralized place, you need a polity or like some sort of chief.
Because you become a target.
Yeah. There's something to steal.
Yeah.
Right? Hunter-gatherers don't have much to steal. Farmers have a lot to steal. And your population density is increasing, and we know that when you have increased population density, you have more disease. And so all of a sudden...
That coupled with the fact that farmers domesticated animals.
Yes.
So they domesticated in Western Eurasia, for instance, cattle, sheep, goats.
Even today, we're scared of chicken flu.
Yeah.
Bird flu. I mean, these sorts of things are still occurring.
But the diseases that we think of as being the scourges of, even the 19th century, really kind of pre-vaccination scourges, most of them hop the species barrier from our domesticated animals. Like
smallpox, I think, did.
Yeah, and measles was, I think, a rinderpest, and, several examples like that. So, you've got higher population density, you've got these, crazy animals that are literally living in the house with you or living just, below you on the lower level or right out in the yard. And you have very close contact with them. And so the combination means you've got all these diseases. And so... it's interesting to think about, say, the biblical stories of plagues and whether, those are shared memories of, the emergence of a new zoonotic disease, a disease that comes in from an animal into the human population.
And we've seen this in historical time. The Italian lowlands in classical antiquity were much more densely populated than they were in the medieval period. And part of this is just the introduction of malaria, or the emergence of malaria occurred, within historical memory. By the early medieval period, the Roman population is talking about how malaria is actually their ally against occupation, whereas during the classical period, malaria was unknown, and so there was high population density in the lowland zones, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think about malaria in Europe, but, malaria was present in Europe until very recently.
And we see it in the genes.
Yeah.
There's malaria adaptation all across the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
And malaria was also present in the United States, like not just in the South, but in the Northeast.
My grandmother had it as a child growing up in the South.
Yeah.
So she caught it in the 20s.
Yeah. So, all these diseases, this is one of the primary distinctions between the Neolithic revolution. It was frankly rather miserable. You didn't have as much of a diversity of diet. There was a lot of backbreaking, monotonous labor. You didn't get to wander as much because you didn't have the time, you didn't have the leisure, and there was also plague and a lot more disease because people were in a much more like dense living circumstance. Just imagine how much less hygienic it is to live in a village as opposed to live in a small hunter-gatherer band that was nomadic.
Yeah, and it's incredible. You look at these numbers again. This is referring back to the Lawrence Angel study from the 80s, where he's looking across that Paleolithic Neolithic barrier, and you see the drop in average lifespan significantly as you move into the Neolithic. The thing is, it doesn't start to rise again significantly until the 20th century.
Yeah.
So until the development of modern medicine, vaccination, antibiotics. So if you are the average, Roman centurion, or you're living in the medieval period in southern England, or you're a factory worker in the British Midlands in the 19th century, you're still dying mostly, in your 30s. Maybe you'll make it to 40.
Yep. Yep.
That's pretty scary.
So, I mean, this is a theory I've had for a long time. This is not primary topic of the podcast, but I'm going to bring it up. I do have a hypothesis that our high productivity, our relatively affluent lifestyle in the West today has resulted in a reversion back to a type of individualism, which is actually much more akin to hunter-gatherers. I think a lot of the traditional practices and customs that constrain human freedom into these very, very hierarchical structured societies emerged during the Neolithic to deal with all the stresses of population density, disease, intergroup conflict. And I think now that, some of us have moved beyond that, we have shed a lot of those cultural constraints. And I think...
Well, the best example would probably be organized religion.
Yeah, that's what... Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think organized religion is... I mean, there's a classic Marxist perspective. It's there to control, but... Obviously, organized religion emerges in societies where you need something to bind people together that aren't related and don't know each other.
Yeah.
Right? And hunter-gatherers didn't really have that much of a problem because they're hanging out in bands of probably no more than 100 max and often closer to 10.
Yeah. And, you talked earlier about the FST or the genetic differences between Northern European hunter-gatherers and Chinese being akin to what we saw between, the incoming Neolithic groups, the farmers, and the neighboring hunter-gatherer populations. And if you think about this as like a proxy for language divergence, that would imply that they're speaking like different language families in the same way that, the Sino-Tibetan languages are a different family from Indo-European, which would include the present-day European languages. And some linguists have suggested, that you go back to the dawn of the Neolithic, and basically all of these Neolithic villages, these Natufian/Neolithic villages, are speaking completely different languages, and that would have been what the hunter-gatherer landscape looked like.
Yeah.
And so the cultural differences would have been much greater than we're used to today. Yeah. It's as though, you could walk half a mile across the city you live in, and everybody goes from speaking English to speaking, Mandarin.
Yeah, which you kind of see that in, Papua New Guinea, which did go through the Neolithic Revolution, but kind of stopped before the Metal Age. So, there's these valleys that are, warring with their neighboring valleys, and there's very little gene flow, and, warfare is endemic and conflict, and people have a very, very narrow horizon in their world. And this might have been the landscape in Europe before the rise of complex states and institutional religions, and the Roman Empire homogenized a lot of things, and that's when history starts in much of Europe.
It's very Tolkien-esque.
Yeah, it is.
Different groups of people that are so different that you see them as almost being different creatures, and you read Herodotus and you read his fanciful descriptions of all of these different people at the margins of the Greek Empire.
Yeah.
And, a lot of that stuff is true in a certain sense. I mean, he obviously exaggerated a bit, but, there's a lot of diversity out there.
Or there was.
There was.
There was. So, I mean, I think one of the issues that's implicit in what we're talking about right now is the Neolithic Revolution and the farming revolution came at different times. We have these differences between different populations that are due to when the farming arrived, right? And so you have some populations, say in northern North America, which practice either no farming or very, very light farming. And so they don't have the same adaptations that, say, a population in the Middle East, which has been farming for 10,000 years, would have, right? Yeah. You see that in the genes. So the history and lifestyle is having an effect on our genes today.
Let's think about that. I like to do this little thought experiment and, imagine myself at the very edge of the Neolithic world. Who would those last hunter-gatherers in Europe have been, for instance?
I mean, definitely, people in the Baltic, right? So people in Finland, parts of Sweden, and that's where you see the pitted ware culture. You see hunter-gatherer cultures that are relying on marine resources, cheek by jowl with farmers, right up until the arrival of Indo-European languages. And in the northeast corner of the Baltic, it looks like it took a really long time for them to be able to have oats well adapted enough, because I think that's all they could grow.
Because you're so far north.
Yeah, it's just, these Middle Eastern crops are not well adapted to Northern Europe. So the Neolithic Revolution kind of stopped for a while. And
this shows the limitation, again, of being tied to the crops that you rely on culturally. So, you're coming out of the Middle East, and your wheat and your barley is adapted to grow in that environment, those diurnal rhythms of the length of the day, the length of the night, the length of the season, and the amount of moisture. And you move up to some place like northern Germany, or along the Baltic, southern Finland, and that's a very different environment. You see the same thing in East Asia. So the ancestors of the Polynesians come out of Taiwan.
Yeah.
They start off as rice growers, so different crops they're cultivating, but similar latitude in terms of what they expect in terms of day length and so on. And they move down into the tropics, and it turns out that rice doesn't grow that well down there, at least the varieties that they were cultivating initially. And this is part of the reason we believe they took on all of the crops from the area around Papua New Guinea. So the reason you don't see people growing rice out in Tahiti and Hawaii is because taro and bananas and breadfruit were a lot better to cultivate around the tropics.
Yeah, and once they got to New Zealand, they didn't really expand much into the South Island, aside from hunting expeditions, because even those crops that they had picked up in
the sweet
Melanesia,
potato,
it just would not work at those latitudes, so they were constrained, right? And going back to Europe, I do have to say we do see in the Baltic and Northeast Europe some evidence of eventually hunter-gatherer peoples switching to agriculture. It just shows you that this is one of the areas that it happened while there was like thousands and thousands of years of time for them to switch, and that's why they could probably do it, because the farmers from the Middle East, they stopped in Germany and Poland. They couldn't go any further. That stoppage allowed the hunter-gatherers to adapt culturally. And eventually, they found a way to farm in that region. So there are very special conditions, like whether it's distance, whether it's climate, where hunter-gatherers can persist against like the onslaught of the farmers, right?
Well, one of the things that, fascinates me about Japan, I visited there several years ago, is that Japan only made the Neolithic transition about 2,000 years ago. So basically in the Common Era, almost, the Japanese are still living as hunter-gatherers, and it's because of those incredibly rich fishing grounds like the ones you mentioned.
This is the common variable that we're alluding to: Pacific Northwest, the Baltic, the North Sea, Japan. If you have marine resources, you can have much higher population densities, and you can resist farmers for a long time. It's all about numbers.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Bantu in Africa, because they're a special case.
Okay.
The Bantu, more than any other group, I think, really went on a tear geographically and had a huge genetic impact. And we talked about the Bushmen being forced off into the desert areas, but tell me a little bit about who the Bantu were and why they were so successful at dominating Africa genetically.
Well, I mean, the Bantu they were on the edge of the West African continual populations, right? In modern-day Cameroon is what it seems like. And then 3,000 years ago, they picked up agricultural lifestyle, and then eventually they also picked up iron. So agriculture plus iron, it seemed like they went gangbusters. Basically, they went into the lakes region of Africa. They swept south. They eventually went all the way to the Cape. And then on the other end, they went down through Gabon and Congo and Angola. And so they met up eventually in South Africa. The only exception here is in the Kalahari and a few areas around the Cape, which had a Mediterranean climate. So again, we're alluding to the fact that climate is very constraining here. Their agricultural toolkit was a tropical one. And they also adapted somewhat. They became pastoralists in East Africa, so they were flexible in terms of interacting with Nilotic peoples. Basically, we're seeing in the Bantu, perhaps like on the edge of history, the same dynamic that we saw in Europe, where some small group of hunter-gatherers switched to the agricultural lifestyle. And once you have this advantage, it takes a really, really long time for anybody else to figure out how to catch up with you. You have more people, you have more innovation, you have more ideas, and you keep expanding, and your network keeps growing bigger and bigger. And so from Cameroon,
and it's literally like a human wave.
Yeah,
a human tidal wave.
And if you look at the genetic data of Bantu from, say, KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and you compare them to peoples in Central African Republic up by Chad, they are much closer, far, far closer to those people than they are to people right on the other side of South Africa that are Khoi.
Yeah.
Or Bushmen. It's very, very strange. It would be like, Africa's big continent. It would be like someone at the Ural Mountains is much closer to someone in northern Spain than someone in northern Spain is to someone in southern Spain.
Yeah. That's crazy.
It's really incredible when you look at the genetic data. And I know some archaeologists did propose that maybe it was a cultural diffusion. But first of all, the genetics does not suggest that at all. But also, I mean, if you look at the people, you can see that the people in Mozambique look far more like the people in East Africa and Central Africa. Even though they all look different, there are differences, which I think anyone can... If you met a Kenyan, they do not look like someone from South Africa. But the gap between...
They're later Nilotic migrations and so on.
But when you look at, say, like a Bushman or a Khoi pastoralist, a Nama from Namibia, that's a whole different population.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and so...
Differences in skin color and hair type and facial shape.
This goes back to what you were talking about earlier about Europe. You know, these populations that were as genetically distinct as Chinese and Northern Europeans, we know for certain that they did not look similar. Like, the hunter-gatherers are almost certainly likely to be, like, much darker skinned.
This is in Europe.
Yeah, much darker skinned in Western Europe, and a lot of the light skin, the alleles that cause lightness that we know of, those genetic variants seem to have come with farmers. So hunter-gatherer Europeans, aside from their eye color, which seems like it was going to be blue, which they had. So modern Europeans are kind of a mix between these two types. Obviously, they have their own distinctive phenotype, distinctive appearance or characteristics, but it's all triggered by this cultural revolution of the farming, where you had, you know, these demographic waves coming out of the Middle East, and different populations in different parts of the world, you know, interacted with those waves in different ways.
Yeah, and so you can imagine this, you know, being played out globally.
Yes.
Emanating from these centers of the Neolithic.
The ones you talked about earlier.
And so, you know, you completely reshape the phenotype of the people living in that part of the world.
Yep.
So, you know, the reason we think of sub-Saharan Africans looking a certain way today is because of the Bantu expansion.
Yes.
And there was a lot more diversity in phenotype before that. Do we see the same thing in East Asia?
Yeah, it seems like definitely like, you see it more in Southeast Asia in the transition. It seems that they came from the north, and there is a minority component in Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia, which is more like the people in Papua. Not quite, because so when you were
the so-called Negrito populations.
Yeah, although you know these Negrito populations, you know, little Negroes, a lot of them are smaller in stature, but the latest work I've seen suggests that the marginalization into, you know, territories with fewer resources is the key. They probably weren't that small initially, just like Papuans are not that small. They're relatively large people.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've actually worked with the Aita on the island of Luzon, the main island in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And they're surrounded by people who look, you know, basically East Asian.
Yeah.
And these guys literally look like African pygmies.
Yeah.
They are, you know, 3.5, 4 feet tall, very dark skin and frizzy hair. It's not the straight hair that you see in the average Filipino. You know, so phenotypically they're quite different, and they have some really interesting genetic lineages.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't done whole genome work on the samples yet, but we've looked at Y and mtDNA, and you know, they look different.
Yeah. And they're distantly
the dominant kind of Austronesian Filipino population.
Yeah, the last I checked, they are distantly related to Papuans. Again, these are very distant because hunter-gatherers have very deep local lineages often, but they're not like that closely related to East Asians. If you go to the Andaman Islands, where there's another population of Negritos, you know, if you read the ethnography there, they often have really high mortality rates when they live near Indians, mainlanders that come and live in the Andaman Islands. And it resembles the interaction of whites and Native Americans in the United States, where they just didn't have resistance to the disease.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
And the other thing is, I have read that there's an island, Sentinel Island, which you know about, which is isolated from the main Andamans, and there's no interaction, or that no interaction is allowed. And I have read that when people look at those islanders on video, they do not look as small. So it may be that exposure to farming diseases has a very, very negative effect on the overall health of hunter-gatherers.
Interesting. It's like the cultural equivalent of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Yeah.
So if you perturb the system in some way by studying it, it's going to change what you're seeing.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate, but this sort of, you know, going back to the Pritchard paper, you see selection events around digestion and metabolization, and you also see selection almost always on the immune system.
Yeah.
You know, I mean...
New diseases.
Yeah, new diseases. And, you know, there is a hypothesis that sex emerged as a way to, you know, avoid pathogen infection because pathogens like microbes evolve so fast, you know? Farmers really took that to the next level when it came to pathogens. So it's a shock to your system, and if you've ever been to a village in the third world, you will understand why hunter-gatherer immune systems are not optimized to handle that shock.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's just end on that note. This whole concept that what we see today is the end result of a process that really kicked off in earnest in the Neolithic, a process of homogenization, and that what was there before the dawn of agriculture 10,000 years ago was probably a lot more diverse than what we see today.
Yeah.
Probably a lot more languages, probably by an order of magnitude or more.
Yeah.
A lot of different phenotypes, many of which probably don't exist anymore.
Yep.
Anything like what they were then, at least.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the dawn of the Metal Age, certainly in Western Eurasia with the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age. Iron Age also in Africa, we see the spread of empires and so on, and that was a further homogenization. We see evidence of that genetically, but there was this world way back when things were really unusual and interesting and very different from today.
Which DNA is giving us a window to. I mean, this whole discussion is alluding to gene culture coevolution, and that you can't really understand one without the other. And genetics is kind of an interface between the evolution and the culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
All
okay,
right.
Let's end there.
Okay.
For more information about Insitome, our podcasts, and our genetic products, check out our website at insito.me. That's INSITO.me.